Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Amy Stewart, and I will be your host this afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Unpacking Coaching Mindsets, a conversation with principals and coaches, with Jacy Ippolito and Rita Bean, authors of Cultivating Coaching Mindsets, an action guide for literacy leaders, and their new book, Unpacking Coaching Mindsets, Collaboration Between Principals and Teachers. Our webinar today is scheduled for about 45 minutes, and we will have time for questions at the end. Before we start, I have a few helpful reminders for today's webinar. First, your audio lines are muted during the presentation. However, we welcome your questions and comments. You may do so at any point of the presentation using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a link will be distributed to you via email. Feel free to share the presentation with your colleagues who are unable to attend. With that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Jacy Ippolito is an associate professor and department chair of secondary and higher education in the School of Education at Salem State University. Jacy's research, teaching, and consulting focus on the intersection of adolescent and disciplinary literacy, literacy coaching, teacher leadership, and school reform. Rita M. Bean is Professor Emerita of the University of Pittsburgh, Department of Instruction and Learning. For over 25 years, she taught students preparing to be reading specialists and served as director of the Reading Center. Prior to joining the university, she taught at the elementary level and served as reading coordinator K-12, the role which stimulated her interest in coaching to support teacher professional learning. Without further delay, I'll turn it over to you, Jacy and Rita.
Thanks.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, the slide's not moving on my computer. So help me out, Amy. Now it is. Okay. So let me go back one.
Now we have the power, Rita. Watch out.
Okay. I'm going to go back a little and start us all over again. Harnessing the power of collaboration. So again, let me join Amy in saying welcome. Jacy is in Boston. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we're doing this together. So if there's a little bit of a pause at any time, just recognize that it may be because of the distance between us. But we do want to welcome you to this webinar on harnessing the power of collaboration, or unpacking coaching mindsets. And we're hoping that we have some principals as well as coaches here today to join us in this our webinar. So why collaboration? Well, what we know is we can't make progress in isolation. We understand that one of the biggest barriers to school improvement is the isolation of teachers who work separately, what some might call an egg crate system. And so there's lots of emphasis on having leadership teams in school composed of many different participants. They make decisions about grouping and instruction, and we see the focus on professional learning communities, another way of providing collaborative learning among our educators. So let's get to know each other a little before we begin our presentation, and I will start. Again, I'm Rita Bean, and as Amy told you, I've been a reading specialist, I've been a literacy coach. I've had multiple opportunities also to do research on what their roles are and what they see as important for working in the schools. And in many ways, I guess, because I've been doing this for such a long time, I really like to think of myself as a champion of this group of specialized literacy professionals. Jacy, what about you?
Absolutely. I love that, Rita, champion of literacy professionals. So welcome, everybody. Hi, I'm Jacy Ippolito. Amy, thanks for the nice, warm introduction. I am a professor at Salem State University, Salem, Massachusetts, where I teach courses in literacy and leadership. Before working in higher ed, I was a K-12 reading specialist and focused primarily at the middle grade level. Became a literacy coach, and that really spurred my interest in these kind of shifting roles between specialist and coach, and working even at the school or district level as a literacy leader. And certainly the relationships with principals, it was impressed upon me very early, was so critical to success in the role. And much like Rita, I certainly see myself as an advocate for specialized literacy professionals, principals, and literacy leadership teams. And so that's really the genesis of a lot of our writing and certainly this presentation today about the power of collaboration. And just to say a little bit more about today's agenda, we're going to try to move along at a pretty swift pace. We have kind of 4 big areas that we'd like to touch on, a couple of resources we'd like to share, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. But before we push on any further, we'd also like to get to know you a little bit. We're well aware that we have a number of folks joining us live, and we thought a nice way to quickly get to know you just a little bit would be to ask you a couple questions about what roles you play in schools and to see kind of who is on the line with us. So Amy is going to work a little magic behind the scenes here, I think, and we have just a couple quick poll questions. These should be pretty easy, multiple choice. Right, so what level of school do you work in? Just take a second to click one of these. If it doesn't fit your particular role, that's fine, and we'll just kind of move on, but we'll see what the majority of folks' responses are. Okay, so that was question number 1. It looks like, okay, great. Looks like we have 34% elementary, 25% middle high school, and a number of folks from higher education. Fantastic, welcome. We're so glad you're here with us. All right, let's see. Question number 2, what role do you play in schools? Again, we understand that this may not fit everyone here, but we'll just try to capture the majority. Again, please select all that apply. We understand that we all wear many hats. You know, for myself, I would have clicked all of the first 3. Okay, wow, fantastic. So it looks like many of you are working as coaches, at least part of your time. Many of you, almost 20% almost, are specialists, and another almost 20% are principals, assistant principals, or district level administrators. Fantastic, a really nice spread of specialized literacy professionals and formal leaders. Wonderful. So again, this is really quick. Do you have literacy specialists working in your school? These are folks who primarily are going to be working with students, whether as interventionists or push-in classroom settings. Students are the kind of primary audience here. Okay, fantastic. So about 3/4 of us have literacy specialists working in the school, doing some of that kind of student support work. Wonderful. Now we're curious, so many schools now have developed instructional leadership teams or literacy leadership teams, and we are curious if in your work that is part of how you're spending your time, kind of collaborating with a literacy or a kind of instructional leadership team. Okay, wow, fantastic. That's probably a little higher even than we would have expected, so that is wonderful. Okay. And then we're coming to the end here. So how often do you meet with colleagues, administration? How often are you kind of talking with each other about literacy teaching and learning in the building, in your school? So think of this as like kind of coach, principal, or specialist principal, or that leadership team we just mentioned. How often are you meeting and talking? Oh my goodness, look at this, daily. About 1/3 of us are talking daily, a little bit more than 1/3 weekly, 25% monthly. Fantastic. This is exactly what we're kind of hoping to see. Okay, Amy, that very well may have been the last question. Thank you so much for just giving us a little bit of a snapshot of who you are. It certainly helps us as we kind of launch into sharing with you some of our work and helping us kind of frame some of our conversation as we know a little bit more about you. All right, Rita, let's move on to the next piece. We're going to start by giving you a little snapshot of some of our work, just so that you have a sense of kind of the perspectives and frameworks that we're coming from. And first and foremost, our book, Cultivating Coaching Mindsets, an action guide for literacy leaders. You know, in this book, we really kind of set out this argument that coaching is a verb. It's a set of actions. It's not just a title or a role. So often, many of the people coaching in schools these days are not actually formal coaches. They're specialists, they're team or teacher leaders. And we really start this argument in the book that most important above all else are the mindsets that educators adopt as they go about their coaching work. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's the book that we really started to set that out. A few years later, actually just this year, 2018, we published a follow-up to that called Unpacking Coaching Mindsets, Collaboration Between Principals and Coaches. And this book really came about because as we were working with the first book, we realized, you know, busy principals, busy administrators, they might want a shorter, kind of more succinct guide to coaching work and the mindsets that are imperative for coaches to be successful. And we really wanted to kind of highlight the fact that really to support coaching in schools, it's about partnering, it's about collaboration, and it's about how administrators, formal leaders, and literacy leaders, teacher leaders, coaches all collaborate to improve teaching and learning around literacy. And so this little brief kind of guide is in many ways pitched kind of perfectly for principals, administrators, and team leaders, coaches, anyone kind of thinking about how do we partner more effectively.
Jacy, I like to think of it as our elevator book. You know, you've heard about the elevator speech where you can, in 3 minutes, quickly give a synthesis of things. Well, that's what we've done with this book. It's really a summary of the big book. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And it's really meant to be a kind of conversation guide for principals and coaches together. One other quick note. Obviously, Rita and I have lots of different articles. You can kind of find a lot of our work online these days, but we wanted to quickly highlight the Learning Sciences International blog, which you can go to through this link, blog.learningsciences.com. Rita and I think, have written something like 4 or 5 blog posts there at this point in time. And our last 2 posts, both published kind of early fall and over the summer, really are based on this latest book and are around the idea that, you know, conversations between coaches and principals are key to framing the work and to messaging that work to all the faculty in the building. So just wanted to highlight that as a resource for everyone as well. Okay, without further ado, let's talk for just a moment about the framework that is really at the core of a lot of our work. This 4-part framework to effective coaching really just kind of acknowledges that anyone who's in a coaching role, whether that's a formal coach, a specialist, a teacher leader, a principal, or assistant principal, needs to be focusing simultaneously on individuals and systems, adopting particular mindsets, differentiating adult learning, and attending to school culture. We're not going to spend a ton of time unpacking this framework right here. You actually can go online and through Learning Sciences or YouTube and look at one of our past webinars where we take a lot more time and unpack all the elements of this. But here I think it's most important just to mention that from the perspective of collaboration and how principals, coaches, teacher leaders, specialists can all be working together, we really are going to kind of zoom in on the kind of top left 2 elements of this framework, the individuals and systems and culture, right? How can we be shaping school culture and creating a culture of coaching and collaboration by attending both to the individual needs of teachers, the individual needs of coaches, and thinking systemically about how we're messaging what the work of coaches and specialists might be in the school. And so that's really our focus for today. So we're about to talk about 4 big, what we call critical conversations for coaches and principals. We think of these as, the 4 areas that are in some ways your non-negotiables. These are 4 topics that across the year, as a literacy leadership team, as specialists and coaches, you want to be making sure that you are kind of in conversation with principals and school leaders around. So first and foremost, coach specialist roles and responsibilities. It's quite difficult to proceed without a really clear shared understanding of those roles. B is communication. What does effective communication look like among these literacy leaders in the building? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Literacy assessment work. How do we make sure that any plans we're making as a literacy leadership team or as a coach-principal pair is guided by the literacy assessment work going on in your school? And lastly, teaching and learning goals. How are we ensuring that we have clearly crafted and well-articulated, well-communicated teaching and learning goals around literacy that are really reaching every teacher in the building? So those are the 4 big areas we'll explore today. And I will turn it over to Rita to start us talking a little bit about coach specialist roles and responsibilities.
Right, and I really like this slide because I think the clearer the better is absolutely the message that we want to share with you. Overwhelmingly, I've done a lot of research with coaches and specialists, and when they're interviewed, they talk about 2 important things that affect their role in school and their effectiveness. First, they know what they're expected to do. They have clear expectations of their role. And I'd like to mention the other at this point too, and that is that the principal has an understanding of their role and supports them in it. Overwhelmingly, these are the 2 factors that seem to affect the success of coaches and specialists in schools. Let me move on to the next slide, though, which is actually from a set of standards that the International Literacy Association put out recently. And we made a big change in how we define what each of these specialized literacy professionals is responsible for. And this graphic was designed to illustrate the differences in how we see the level of emphasis. So if you look at the first line and you look at the reading literacy specialists, we're saying they spend less time with the system, with school as a whole, more time with teachers, and most of their time is spent in instructing students. If you go down to the literacy coach, you see that the literacy coach spends less time with students, a little more time with the system, and a lot of their time, their emphasis with teachers. And then you can go on to the literacy coordinator, and again, here you see less time with students, more time with teachers, and the most of their time is spent with the system. Now, why is this important? Well, what we wanted to do was to help, number one, those institutions preparing these professionals to understand what the competencies might be for each of those certifications or degrees. And secondly, we wanted to help our candidates and our folks in positions understand what their responsibilities might be. Now, is this real? Not always. This is general, and that's why the blurry lines in this particular graphic. There are no clear demarcations between each of these roles. So we know that in many schools that coaches work with students, and we know in other schools that reading specialists have coaching responsibilities. So we know that in reality, things will differ depending on the context. In fact, I can give you an example of someone I talked with recently, a coach. His definition, his job description is coach. And when I talked with him, he said, well, I coach 3 periods a day, and the rest of the time I work as an interventionist. So that's just an example of how, although the graphic is there to guide you, it is not always what we see happening in reality. But the important thing to remember, in my view, is that everybody is on the same page in terms of responsibility. Now, you can find this graphic and explanation in an article in the Reading Teacher, February 2018. And if you want to think more about these distinctions in roles and our framework, we suggest the first chapter in our little book, Unpacking Coaching Mindsets. And that's just a reminder for you that that 6 pages will give you a lot of information. One other resource that we like to share a lot of resources with you because we know that you're here on the internet and that most of you are using the internet to access materials. So the multiple roles of school-based specialized literacy professionals is another resource that you can get free from the International Literacy Association just by going online. So we did want to mention that to you also. So to kind of finalize this particular business of roles, these are questions that we actually had in the blog, and we put them on the slide for you. And I know some of you will go to the archived version, and you can look at these. So I'm not going to read them to you, but I think that we want to emphasize the importance of a written job description so that everybody understands what the role is. But I think the second question is the important one in my view. There are often different expectations among various stakeholders. We'll take the coach role, for example. Principals might expect the coach to work with teachers who might be having difficulty, but the coach believes that she or he should work with all teachers, doesn't want to be identified as someone whose responsibility is to fix somebody. And teachers will differ in their expectations. Some, unfortunately, believe coaches are there to, in quotes, police their work, while others see them as mentors, and others see them as individuals who can help them think more deeply about their instructional practices. Again, I'm going to use the same message. Getting them on the same page is important. So JC, how about moving to the second topic?
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Rita. You know, core to everything Rita was just talking about is clear communication between specialists, coaches, principals. If we're ever able to articulate these roles clearly and message them out to the entire school, we need to have clear communication channels. And that's certainly one of the foundations we want to talk about for just a few moments. So one of the most important things right up front is establishing a clear communication plan with your principal, with your literacy leadership team. So whether it's one-on-one meetings between coaches and principals or specialists and principals, or whether this is a small group or team meeting regularly, many of you said you were meeting daily or weekly, certainly monthly. It's important to have that as kind of sacred time, right? That you hold other kind of pressing business aside and say, we are going to kind of make sure that we hold this time to talk about the work of professional learning for teachers and the work of interventions and instruction for students. Oftentimes we recommend, put a date on the calendar every month or perhaps every other week. Weekly is great, but I know a lot of folks don't have that flexibility. We recommend also often having a quick agenda template, something that you don't have to kind of recreate every time you meet. And it might just have 4 or 5 bullets on it, something to say, updates about the work, any concerns, might be, how is the work connecting to our larger vision for the year. When I've been observing with literacy leadership teams, the teams that have that kind of quick agenda template are able to run through their business quite efficiently and are then able to kind of always save a little time for those urgent matters that of course come up every week, or if not every day. I think it's also important to mention what's off limits, right? So often as a coach myself, I had a great relationship with my principal, and it was a little bit of a tension to not kind of fall into talking about individual teachers, right? Where the principal would even just kind of casually, and not on purpose, right? Just kind of say, oh, how is so-and-so doing? And it was only in kind of a clear conversation that she and I were able to say, actually discussing individual teachers is in some ways, a small violation of that coach-teacher relationship. And so I find it helpful, even at the beginning of every year, to just kind of review a little bit what is inbounds and out of bounds for some of these literacy leadership conversations. So Rita, if we can move on to the next slide. I want to also just say a bit more about the agendas. So I think sometimes when we're meeting as literacy leadership teams, we're meeting in small groups, that's when we kind of think about agendas or even discussion-based protocols. We're big fans of the work at the School Reform Initiatives.org. They have hundreds of protocols and conversation starters for adults in schools who are thinking about leading professional learning. And those structures are often well used for kind of exploring text, for solving dilemmas, for exploring different ways of thinking about kind of the everyday work that we're doing. And so we certainly recommend looking through some of those. We have a number of those protocols in both of our books that we've adapted and used over time with coaches and principals. But there is this larger piece of also rotating roles. Particularly if you're meeting as a literacy leadership team, it's often very helpful to take turns facilitating so that the meeting is not always run by the principal or not always run by the coach, not always run by the specialist. By sharing that facilitation load, we also in many ways practice and model the kind of work we want to be doing with teachers. I'll say one more piece about this. Though we think about using agendas and protocols in groups, it certainly is also effective, even if you're having one-on-one conversations, say as a coach-principal pair, to again have that agenda template or have the kind of quick list of what is it each week that we're going to be talking about. A principal I work with and the coach have a Google Doc that they share, and it's almost a parking lot for ideas. Either one of them can put some ideas there across the week, and then when they get together on Monday morning, they can just kind of run right down the list of things that they've been thinking about or that they wanted to touch base with one another about. And it just is a huge time saver and a way to kind of capture some of their good thinking as they're both kind of running around the building any given week. So we just wanted to share a few ideas for what principals can specifically do to support their own specialists and their own coaches when they're having these kind of one-on-one or small group meetings or even meeting in a larger kind of faculty setting. So first and foremost, it's so critical to provide positive and constructive feedback. One of the things that Rita and I hear a lot from coaches and specialists in the field is that they don't always necessarily kind of know where they stand with their work. I think oftentimes, for me, this is reflected in the idea that when I first started coaching after a few months in the role, I kind of said to the principal, well, how am I doing? Am I hitting the target? And the answer back was, well, I haven't heard any complaints, so you must be doing fine. And, it really struck me that, we needed to make sure that we were having much more ongoing, regular conversations about what, is the target being hit. Principals and formal leaders can articulate the importance of coaching work in large group settings with faculty meetings, kind of continually referring teachers back to coaches as an important source of expertise in the building. Principals certainly can, whenever possible, we know it's not always possible, but attending team meetings, even just for a few minutes, sitting in on professional learning activities, it really signals that the principal and coach are a partnership in this work. We mentioned it briefly before, but maintaining both teacher and coach confidentiality. One of the hardest things I think for coaches is if a formal leader kind of reveals to a teacher the conversations that are being had, about the work. That can be a little uncomfortable at times. So maintaining that confidentiality is important. We've said it before, but maintaining just regular coaching meetings. One coach I work with says she always feels a little bit like she's kind of chasing the principal in order to kind of have a chat. And, this year in particular, they just now have regular meetings on the book. It makes all the difference. And finally, really having an honest conversation with coaches and specialists about what the best ways to communicate are, both with them as a principal and with the wider community. This just happened at a school I work with where there was a bit of a survey that was put out. How do we as adults in the building want to communicate? Is email best? Should we be using Google Docs? How do we want to spend our time when we are in-person meetings? Getting really clear about that can save a lot of time and angst on the back end.
Okay, and JC, I'm going to talk about what coaches can do. We listed some things that principals can do, but we think it's important for coaches to understand that they have some responsibilities too that will help them and the principal work together more effectively. So number one, sharing your schedule with the principal. I always say that's really important for several reasons. One, the principal is aware of the many responsibilities you have and of how full your time is. But in addition, the principal can get a sense of the extent or the breadth of the work that you're doing in the school. And even more than that, share the specifics of your goals and your ongoing work. What we found is that if you can tell the principal that this week or this month, let's say this month, I'm working with the 4th grade team to get them involved in writing workshop, and this is the way that I'm going to do it, the principal has a better sense not only of what you're doing, but perhaps what resources you need. So maybe there's a way that he can help you, or he or she can help you do that by providing a little more time for you or providing materials for you or so forth. So that's really critical. Provide a summary of your work. This is helpful not only for the principal, by the way, but also helpful for you. What did you accomplish this week in a one-page kind of blog? What were the successes you had? What were some of the dilemmas or challenges that you really want to work on? And they provide you with something that you can share with your principal. By the way, I also mentioned that often principals are responsible for evaluating the work of the specialized literacy professional, and it's so different from a teacher's work that they're not quite sure at times exactly how to evaluate your work. So having some sort of summary can be really helpful. And I think, again, the importance of being honest about challenges you're facing, because you can get some support and some help from the principal, some perhaps direct advice about how you might work with a particular team of teachers. And finally, as we've said over and over again, maintain principal confidentiality, that what's said in the principal's office or in the meeting room stays in the principal's office or the meeting room. And finally, no surprises. Always better to over-communicate. The principal doesn't want to hear from some teacher that you've made major changes in the grouping or the assessment system or whatever it is. So I think these are all things that perhaps can be helpful to the coach in thinking about how to communicate effectively with the principal. And again, we have some free takeaways. I wrote this several years ago with Diane DeFord, and we actually got our do's and don'ts from literacy coaches in the field, and they gave us some very interesting advice about do's and don'ts. So for example, one coach writes about her work with teachers increased when she moved her office from being near the principal's office to being near the bathroom where the teachers were taking students, because teachers would stop and talk with her, and then they would set up a meeting to do some work in the classroom. So that was one of the do's. And one of the don'ts, of course, is don't try to be an expert. Don't have an answer for everything. It's okay to say, I really don't know, and let's see if we can find the answer together. So that's just I think a nice, brief, quick read. And JC, you had one.
Absolutely. And I should quickly mention that many of these takeaways are posted to this webinar as handouts. So for those of you who are following along right now live, you should be able to download these pretty easily from the handouts. For those that are following along at home later, the links are here for you, and so you should be able to access these online pretty easily. This is a quick article that I wrote a number of years ago now, Principals as Partners with Literacy Coaches. And this came as a result of a study I conducted in a mid-sized city, K-12, looking at coaches' relationships with principals. And in the article, I use kind of 3 vignettes to talk a little bit about 3 kind of bins of relationships we saw from, kind of a neglectful kind of, isolationist almost model where coaches and principals really weren't talking very much at all, to the other end of the continuum where it was almost talking too much, if there is such a thing, and then somewhere right in the middle. And what did that kind of partnering relationship really look like? So we talk about that there as a model and also as a goal that we're always kind of tinkering towards, right? This kind of partnership is not crafted quickly overnight.
Yeah, Jacy, I'd like to mention something here that you brought to my mind. As I've worked in schools, I've seen some principals who really want to kind of give over the literacy program to the coach or the reading specialist, feeling as though they don't have that balance. And I think that's what you're talking about versus other principals
Right.
who have a literacy background. And so they're very comfortable in taking leadership. And I think either one can work as long as both understand their roles and work together collaboratively. Again, we're talking about collaboration. Do you want to make a comment about that, or just?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the expertise, and Rita, we saw this in a recent survey study we did of literacy leaders, of principals actually, right? And certainly a great number of principals have a background in literacy and feel that expertise and are able to talk at kind of a different level with their specialists and coaches. And I think in those instances, it's always important to kind of negotiate the dynamic of, okay, so are we leading the literacy teaching, learning in the building together? Are we co-constructing that? Is the main thrust coming from a school or district kind of mandate? Or, am I kind of really listening, even though I have this expertise, really listening to what my specialists and coaches are kind of saying that they're seeing on the ground with teachers and what the needs are? I have a recent example of that where, the coaches came back to a very knowledgeable principal and said, actually, we need to be doing a lot more, we think, around formative assessment. Here's a proposal we're bringing forward. And the principal was incredibly receptive, but I think the specialists and coaches in that case were a little nervous because the principal is quite knowledgeable in that front. And they were thinking, well, maybe he won't go for it. So I think at the end of the day, it is about open communication and making sure that you are kind of negotiating, what's next in the work.
What works well for your school, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very context dependent.
Yep. Here we go.
So speaking of assessment, this is certainly one of the big conversations that we see coaches and principals, literacy leadership teams needing to have early and often. So literacy assessment work, right? How will we know if we're succeeding? So one of the things that we focus on in both of our books is really the roles that coaches and specialists can play in leading around data in the school building, from helping with data collection to data analysis, really thinking both at the kind of individual and system-wide levels here. Remember, that's one of our big components of our framework, right? So helping individual teachers, drilling down to work with individual students, perhaps, who are needing particular interventions, but also always keeping that larger school picture and that system-wide picture in mind. And the critical role that specialized literacy professionals play in really teaching others in the building how to interpret data. We're big fans of using kind of data-based protocols to guide those conversations, so we're not jumping to kind of incorrect inferences. We show you one that's from our new book quickly here, kind of a data protocol that just slows down the conversation just enough so that we're really making correct inferences and crafting new directions based on solid understandings of what we're actually seeing students do.
Yeah, that's really important, Jacy. I really like that protocol. I think it's easy for teachers to follow, and it's something you can post in the meeting room so that everybody understands what you're going to be doing in that particular meeting. So that's very helpful. But in addition to that, it's really important to think about multiple types of data. And we're especially, we like the work of Victoria Bernhard, who talks about the use of data in schools. And we like to mention this because too often our focus is on student learning data, data from standardized tests, data from various sources. But we think it's important to look at other sources of data. So we mention these here quickly, and again, it's mentioned in our book, but demographics, what's the population in the school? How many EL students do you have? What about gifted? What about students of color? What about poverty and so on? And looking at that information can be very helpful in terms of looking at what the curriculum should be like. And then the student learning, as I mentioned, not only formal tests, but other measures like student work and formative measures. Perceptions are important, not only perceptions of teachers and parents, families, but also of students, especially at the secondary level. And finally, school processes. What is it that you're actually doing in the school as far as literacy instruction? What approaches are you using? What materials? How much time for digital work for the students and so forth? And what is key is not just those 4 types of data, but the interactions between them, so that you can get an idea of which student groups are learning and which are not, which are experiencing difficulty. And what do parents really value in the school about the school processes, so that you are comparing data and looking at relationships and helping you to make decisions. So again, we talk more about that in the book. We also very much appreciate the work of Peter Offenbach when he talks about balanced assessment. And here we're really talking about the system, not individuals, but the system. And so I'll go through these quickly just to highlight what he suggests we need to think about when we consider balanced assessment. One is not only can students do the skills or manage the skills, but do they apply them? So they may know their phonics on a decoding test, but are they using those skills when they're reading various types of text? Are you looking at both basic skills and higher order thinking skills? And what about reading from a single text, but also from other sources, including digital resources? So we're not measuring just how well a student reads a single textbook, but even the interaction across texts. Cognitive and affective, I'd like to see us put much more emphasis on this. We do want to know how well students read, but we also want to know whether they do read. It's kind of like Scott Paris talks about skill and will. So do students have the will to read? And what's the, for example, one might look at the number of books being taken out of the library, the kinds of books that students are reading or taking home, and so on. And finally, as we've mentioned before, the importance of both summative and formative measures, not only those measures that tell us what students can do, but also those measures that help us decide how we're going to instruct. So we think that's critical too.
Absolutely. And so, oh, go ahead, Rita. Sorry.
Oh no, Jacy, go ahead.
No, just going to close out by saying, we offer these questions again as really prompts for literacy leadership teams, for coach-principal pairs, to talk about on a regular basis, what are the assessment practices in place? And really, I think that middle question is the most important. Which practices are serving us well and why? And where might there be some gaps? What do we need to shore up and put into place so that we're actually getting the richest picture of teaching and learning around literacy in our building, which is very context dependent for each school. But keeping an eye on the clock, we're going to move right along to our last conversation that we believe is so important for coaches, principals, leadership teams to be talking about, which is the larger teaching and learning goals around literacy for the school. What's the target? And so we really believe and have seen over our studies and our work in schools that where principals and coaches and specialists are on the same page about literacy teaching and learning goals, you see great achievement across time. It's really that kind of focus and being on the same page that seems to make a great deal of difference. So here are a few things to be considered. Please, Rita.
Okay, and again, because of time, let me just mention a few things here, and you can look at the words on the slide. Basically, too often plans are developed by a few, and then they remain on the shelf. So a good plan is one that can help you stay the course, and it's one that is developed by many, so that people are involved in making decisions about not only what data are used to make this literacy plan, but also the action steps are identified and the milestones are also identified. One important thing that we didn't put on this slide is that you also have a mechanism for evaluating how well things are working. And I think that's also part of developing an effective literacy plan. Questions to consider. Again, just which one or two goals. Too often we have what Taffy Raphael calls the Christmas tree effect, where too many goals are being addressed in a school. And that's JC's comment about focus, a target, so that we know that there are a lot of things that you have to address in school change, but really in a short amount of time, which of the ones are you really going to work on? Are you going to work on developing new materials? Are you going to work on disciplinary literacy? Are you going to work on writing? So these are really important. And as we've mentioned also, who needs to be part of that conversation? Just a quick mention of how important it is to connect these goals to your standards, either of your state or national national standards, because that helps you set high and rigorous expectations.
And so,
Jacy, what are the challenges?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we are well aware that there are a number of challenges here. Just quickly, a few are difficulty adjusting to change, accepting an initiative. Change is always hard in any school, no matter how on the same page the literacy leadership team is. Lack of resources and support certainly can hinder change, and lack of long-term effort. Rita and I talk about this as the kind of on to other things mentality that sometimes we are all kind of caught up in, whether that's district initiatives, school initiatives, or turnover in the building can cause that kind of churn. So here are just a few suggestions.
Yeah, and Jacy and I talked about this, and what we think is really important is to acknowledge the growing pains that come, because this is a journey. This is not quick and easy and a smooth road. We talk about, Michael Fullen talks about an implementation dip, that whenever you start a new initiative, there's going to be a period where performance dips and that people are having trouble, and that's where you have to reach in and provide that positive support, and also some direct help to help teachers understand, well, how exactly am I going to accomplish this particular goal? We often acknowledge the fact that there'll be a groan zone as teachers move from divergent to convergent thinking. But one last point, and that's the importance of monitoring efforts, because regardless of how direct or sharp or well-defined an initiative is, your particular school may need to make some sort of modification in how it is being implemented in that context, because each school differs with motivation, with staff, with resources, and so on. So we think that's an important point. Well, Jacy, we've shared a lot and probably had a little more than we thought we had, but we want to end with something that we think will remind you of the power of collaboration. And those of you who are familiar with Leo Leone's book, Swimmy, will know that Swimmy was able to protect himself and all the other little fish by leading the effort and collaborating, swimming together. So we hope all of you will remember the power of swimming. Thank you so much for spending this 45 minutes or so with us. And I think we'll now go to questions.
Great. Thanks to both of you for taking time out of your day to share your experience and expertise with our audience today. At this time, we'd like to hand it over to our audience to address any questions you may have for our presenters. As a reminder, you can submit questions using the question pane on your screen. With that, I'll go ahead and read the first question for you. Do you have any advice for district leaders or coaches for situations where the district controls and directs the coaches?
Jacy?
Yeah, so this is such an important question. I worked with a district that employed quite a number of coaches, and the coaches would meet regularly at the district level, but then would kind of be deployed out in schools. And so I think it created this dynamic where principals weren't necessarily in the conversation as much as maybe they could have been, right? So the conversation was really happening between coaches and district administrators, and then coaches and teachers, and principals were kind of not as much in that equation. And so I guess I would, in a situation like that, be advocating for principals to play some kind of larger role in that work. Whether that, it probably would need to first be a conversation between principals and district administration, and kind of allowing for and making room for each school's very context-specific differences. I mean, there certainly is great power in a district-wide vision for coaching that's being implemented kind of with some fidelity across all schools. But I think there's always acknowledgement and room for individual school differences and needs and faculty differences, and the principals of each building are going to have their finger on that pulse to some extent. So I guess if I were to come into that situation, I would be arguing for principals to be a bigger part of that conversation.
Yeah, Jacy, I'm thinking of the study we did where actually in the results, I'd say 75 to 80% of the principals indicated that they had major responsibility for making decisions about what would go on in that school. There were only a few who said the district makes the decision and we just follow it. So this is a serious problem because schools do differ, and you need that principal and coach leadership to make change in the schools. I agree with Jacy. This is going to take some sort of initiative by the principals to talk with leadership at the district level to indicate, well, here's what's working well, but here's where we differ. Here's where we need to make some specific and unique changes in how we're going to implement something. It's not easy, but it's going to take, I think, collaboration among the principals to talk with the superintendent or whoever is leading this district level initiative.
Great, thanks both of you. The next question I have, sometimes librarians are the only literacy specialist in the building. What role do librarians play and how can we better support them?
Oh, wow. That's wonderful.
A great question. Yeah.
We love it. Let me start, Jacy, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Please.
We think that librarians have a critically important role in promoting literacy in the schools. And of course, one of the ways in which they can do it is just to be available to say to teachers, okay, what unit are you working on, whether it's reading or science or social studies, and how can I help you find the materials you need so that the students in your classroom have access to a variety of texts at different levels about that particular topic. I think that's one specific way that they can do it. Jacy, do you want to add to that?
Sure. There was a 4-year project I worked on at the high school level, and actually the librarians in that project played an instrumental role in kind of being the glue between a number of teachers who each were piloting practices, trying new things in their classrooms, but weren't always in positions to kind of see what each other were doing or connect with each other on a regular basis. And so the librarians actually ended up kind of helping create a much kind of richer network of professional learning by serving as the kind of intermediaries and saying, so-and-so is doing this in their classroom. Have you connected with them? Or, I could help get, some examples from there to bring to you. And, I think much like specialists, much like coaches, librarians are playing this role where they are kind of seeing the work of the school at a different level and are able to really support teachers just by kind of saying, here's what I'm seeing. How can I help? How can I, support you in doing what you'd like to do?
Right.
Great. All right, next question. What advice would you give to a new literacy coach just beginning in this role?
So much. Do we have another hour, Amy?
If we could sum it up in maybe 1 or 2 points, yeah.
Right. No, I know. Right. I guess I would just quickly say, then I'll turn it to Rita. Be easy on yourself. There's so much good work to do. I think early on in coaching work, it's really easy to beat yourself up that you're not doing everything. Look for a couple small wins. Look for building relationships with teachers. Meet with your principal really regularly and try to solidify as much as you can what the expectations are for your role. Once those expectations are clear, communicate them clearly with all the teachers and focus. It's okay. It took me a long time to realize in coaching work that it's okay to kind of work with a grade level at a time as a cycle, and then move to a different grade level, or work with a teacher for a time, then work with another teacher, right? That you don't have to be doing everything all the time, all at once. You can kind of shift your focus and zoom in a little bit. Rita, what would you say?
Well, I agree with everything that Jacy has said, and I would add only one thing, and I usually share this with new coaches. Start with the people who are receptive to you. Don't try to beat down doors. If you and a teacher have a great relationship and are eager to work with each other, begin. The word will spread. That's the only addition.
Sure.
Perfect. All right. My next question, as far as your work and your publications and your expertise goes, how do these coaching strategies translate over to mathematics coaches? That's for
Jacy.
Thanks, Rita. No, she's saying this because actually, in my own personal coaching work, I was, as a middle school coach, asked very early on to work with math and science and history teachers, of course, which I had very little experience doing at that point in time. And so it was really a crash course. To me, I think the answer that I've come to is that there's a great deal of overlap in what we're talking about as coaching and the work of math coaches, science coaches. I actually now do a good deal of work with all of those disciplinary coaches. And so much of it, the goals are often the same, of having teachers simultaneously have, some fidelity in mathematics, having some fidelity to the curriculum or to, the standards, while also, working around engagement and motivation, working on grouping, working on rich classroom discussions. A lot of the same conversations we have around literacy, we end up having in mathematics or science. Some of the details obviously are a little bit different, but the way I frame a lot of my coaching work, regardless of which content area I'm coaching in, is to talk about disciplinary literacy and to think about what would it mean to apprentice your students in such a way that they're thinking like mathematicians, that they're adopting the habits of mind that are required to read, write, communicate like a mathematician. And when you frame it like that, and you kind of have that apprenticeship kind of piece forefronted, I think a lot of the coaching conversations are the same. I still think in mathematics coaching, small group coaching, I think about it as a balance of individual coaching, so one-on-one with teachers, small group coaching, and then some school-wide professional learning initiatives. And so I see that as very applicable. It's something we talk a lot about in our books. For whatever discipline you're coaching, that methodology is going to be pretty important.
And Jacy, would you agree that that the processes are the same, just as you stated them, but the content differs? And because of that, and if you come from a literacy background, then you're going to have to rely even more on the math teacher to provide that content expertise, because content expertise is important. So you really have to be a learner as a coach if you're working in the various disciplines. For me, anyway.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right, next question. To what extent should teachers be involved in the beginning stages of creating a literacy plan?
Literacy plan for the building?
Yes.
They should be very much involved. I think you need a leader, like a coach or a principal, to start the discussion. You need the data to look at. You need to do some sort of needs assessment. We didn't talk about that today, but somehow there has to be a needs assessment that looks at curriculum, instruction, achievement, and so on. And teachers, if you can work out some subcommittees that might be looking at each of these, but the more you can get ownership. Jacy and I talk about, you don't want just buy-in, you want ownership, because you want the teachers to feel as though they've been part of it. That's a little longer answer than you needed. The short answer is very much involved.
Great, thanks. I have another one here. It says, I'm a new literacy coach, but I'm often asked to function as a substitute teacher. How can I better define my role?
Oh, wow. Yeah. What a great case. I think that oftentimes when you're early in your coaching work, as you're building relationships, as you're defining your role, you tend to, as Rita was kind of hinting, you kind of do what's asked of you. You jump in with both feet and kind of, oh, sure, I can take your classroom for a few minutes. Let me help you out. I often talk with coaches about creating a written kind of one-page like menu of services. I've seen this online. If you Google around, you can find some that talk about it as like appetizers, and entrees and desserts or something like this. And you actually kind of spell out, what are the ways that I can support you? I can, model a lesson. I can co-plan with you. I can sit down and look at some student data with you. I can write, all these different activities. And then what I've seen some really effective coaches do is kind of at the bottom, they'll say, here are some activities I can do in a pinch if you really need me to, but that's not really how I spend the bulk of my time. And so that might be like, if you're desperate, I could make a copy or two for you. I could step in and take a guided reading group for you. I could, substitute in a pinch, something like that. But the idea is that that's a really, really small percentage of the time you want to be spending. And I think that if it starts to become too big a percentage of your time, that's also a time to have that conversation with the principal and say, you're not getting the biggest bang for your buck out of my role if I'm spending, a bigger percentage of my time making copies or substituting or things like this. So I sometimes urge coaches to kind of put it a little bit back on the principal to say, I need a little support here in messaging more clearly to the faculty how I can be most beneficial to them.
Right.
But a little bit of that early on isn't bad. Yeah.
Right. But unfortunately, sometimes this is coming from the principal, and that makes it a little different. True. That the principal is saying, well, I need a substitute for today, and you're it. Again, that's the reason for the job description. That's the reason for, I'll add to this, having some sort of mentor if you can, maybe another coach or a literacy coordinator or somebody who can, again, say, this is the role. But Jacy made the point. Where can you get the most bang for the buck from this particular position? And it's not in substituting. And that's not to say that if there's an emergency that the coach or specialist wouldn't do it. But move slowly, move nicely, but somehow that needs to be said that that is not your role.
One other quick tip on that front, and this is something I used to do very deliberately, is you also kind of fill your schedule. I found early on that if I didn't kind of have a completely full schedule, then I would get pulled in to kind of do these little extra pieces. Oh, could you cover lunch or something like that? And as I kind of continued on, if every day I kind of came and said, oh, could you cover lunch? Could you something? I said, oh, I'm so sorry, but I'm leading this meeting, or I'm co-planning, I'm co-teaching. If your schedule is kind of filled, then it makes it much harder to pull you into these other activities.
Good idea.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you, and thanks for those questions. If there are no further questions, we will conclude the webinar for today. Thank you to all of you who attended, and a huge thanks to both you, Jacy and Rita, for your time today, but also for your dedication to your field. With that, I will ask you all to watch your email for more information on literacy coaching. And in that email, we'll also include a coupon code for their new book, Unpacking Coaching Mindsets. And with that, we hope you have a wonderful day, and have a wonderful, wonderful day to you, Jacy and Rita. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.